This is how people disappear without dying. Some people don't die behind locked doors. They don't collapse. They don't scream. They slowly stop being themselves. Names stop being used. Time stops being measured in days. Faces stop reacting to good news or bad news. What disappears first isn't the body. It's memory, voice, and identity. They wake up the same every morning, wear the same expression, move the same way, and respond to the world like nothing can reach them anymore. From the outside, they look alive. But inside, something essential has already gone missing. This isn't about violence. It isn't about chaos. It's about what happens when a system removes every reminder of who you used to be. Slowly, deliberately, and permanently. And by the time anyone notices, there's nothing left to recover. Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now let's step inside. Disappearance doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with sirens, violence, or spectacle. It starts quietly, almost politely, with small changes that seem harmless on their own. At first, it looks like adjustment. People stop correcting others when their name is mispronounced. They stop mentioning what they used to do for work. They stop explaining themselves. Not because they've accepted their situation, but because explaining no longer changes anything. Identity is built on feedback, on being recognized, on being responded to. When that feedback disappears, identity doesn't shatter. It thins. And thinning is harder to notice than breaking. The first thing taken, choice. The earliest loss isn't freedom in the dramatic sense. It's decision-making. What to eat, when to sleep, where to stand, when to speak. At first, this feels like inconvenience. Annoying, frustrating, temporary. But the human brain is a prediction machine. It survives by expecting cause and effect. When choices stop producing outcomes, the brain adapts by stopping the effort altogether. This is where disappearance starts. Not with despair, but with efficiency. Why decide when the result is already set? Why plan when the plan will be overridden? Why imagine a future when today repeats itself perfectly? Over time, the mind learns a dangerous lesson. Participation is optional. Routine as a weapon. Routine is often described as stabilizing, healthy, necessary. But when routine becomes unbreakable, it stops supporting the mind and starts replacing it. Days become indistinguishable. Weeks collapse into a single memory. Events lose their edges. Ask someone in this state what happened last Tuesday, and they can't tell you. Not because nothing happened, but because everything looked exactly the same. Memory depends on contrast. Without contrast, memories don't form. This is not forgetfulness. It's something worse. It's the inability to store identity across time. When someone can't remember yesterday clearly, they can't imagine tomorrow either. They exist only in the present moment, stripped of narrative. And humans without narrative don't feel like people. They feel like objects being moved through time. The disappearance of language. One of the most alarming signs appears in speech. Sentences get shorter. Vocabulary shrinks. Stories stop being told. Not because there's nothing to say, but because no one is listening in a way that matters. Language exists to connect internal experience with the outside world. When that bridge collapses, the internal world becomes unreachable, even to the person living in it. People begin speaking only when required, only what is necessary, only what is safe. Eventually, silence feels easier, and silence, prolonged enough, becomes identity. Emotional flattening. Disappearance doesn't look like constant sadness. That's a myth. More often, it looks like nothing. Good news lands with a dull thud. Bad news doesn't sting the way it should. Everything feels equally distant. This isn't strength. It's protective numbing. When emotional reactions change nothing, the brain stops producing them. Joy becomes inefficient. Anger becomes risky. Hope becomes exhausting. What remains is a narrow emotional range that keeps the person functioning, but not living. From the outside, this is often misunderstood. They're calm now. They've adjusted. They're doing better. But inside, something critical has gone offline. Time without meaning. Time normally structures identity. Birthdays, milestones, seasons. Here, time becomes abstract. Days are counted only when necessary. Months pass without internal markers. Years feel both endless and empty. People stop aging psychologically, not because they've found peace, but because growth requires novelty, challenge, and feedback. Without those, the mind stalls. A 30-year-old can feel internally frozen at 19. A 50-year-old can feel like time simply stopped. This creates a strange, disorienting sensation, being alive without moving forward. And nothing erodes a sense of self faster than stagnation without an end date. The mirror problem. Eventually, people stop recognizing themselves. Not in a dramatic way, not with panic, just a quiet confusion. Reflections feel unfamiliar. Photos feel like they belong to someone else. Memories feel detached, like borrowed stories. This is not amnesia. It's identity dissociation. The mind creates distance as a survival strategy. If this isn't really me, if this is just a role, if this is temporary, then the pain feels manageable. But over time, the distance becomes permanent. The real self is postponed indefinitely. Always later, always after, and later never arrives. Why this is so effective? No force is required for disappearance. No constant pressure. No visible cruelty. The system doesn't need to attack identity directly. It only needs to stop reinforcing it. Remove choices. Remove meaningful feedback. Remove novelty. Remove future orientation. What remains will still breathe, still walk, still speak when spoken to, but it will no longer assert itself. And a person who doesn't assert themselves is easy to manage, easy to overlook, easy to forget, even by themselves. The lie of adjustment. This phase is often described as adjustment or adaptation. That's misleading. Adjustment implies improvement. Adaptation implies strength. What's actually happening is compression. A wide, complex human identity is being squeezed into something smaller, quieter, and safer. The dangerous part is that it works. People stop resisting because resistance feels pointless. They stop dreaming because dreaming hurts. They stop imagining alternatives because imagination reminds them of loss. And when the mind stops imagining alternatives, it stops believing in escape, even conceptually. That belief doesn't come back easily. The point of no return, quiet version. There is a moment, not a single event, but a phase, where people stop thinking of themselves as someone temporarily passing through a situation. They begin thinking of the situation as who they are now. This is the quiet point of no return. Not because recovery is impossible, but because the desire to recover has faded. Hope isn't crushed. It's forgotten. And forgotten things don't fight back. Why most people never notice. From the outside, nothing looks wrong. There's compliance. There's routine. There's stability. But stability without agency is not health. It's suspension. And suspension is where disappearance thrives. By the time anyone asks, where did that person go? The answer is uncomfortable. They didn't go anywhere. They were slowly erased while still alive. No entry pause point, important. This chapter establishes the mechanism of disappearance, not the environment. Next chapter is where we expose how the system accelerates this process intentionally and why reversal is so rare. Disappearance doesn't happen by chance. It happens because the environment rewards it. Once identity begins thinning, the system doesn't interrupt the process. It leans into it, not out of cruelty, but efficiency. Systems are not built to preserve individuality. They are built to reduce unpredictability. And nothing is more unpredictable than a person who still sees themselves as someone with a past, a future, and a voice. Order over identity. From the moment someone enters this environment, the priority is clear. Order comes first. Not growth. Not rehabilitation. Not restoration. Order. Order requires consistency. Consistency requires uniformity. Uniformity requires the suppression of difference. Individual identity is difference. So identity becomes friction. Every personal habit, preference, or emotional response introduces variables. Variables slow processes down. They create exceptions. They demand attention. Over time, the system learns something simple. People who assert themselves take more work. People who fade require almost none. The reward structure no one talks about. There are no signs that say disappear. No instructions. No overt commands. Instead, there is a reward structure. Compliance is rewarded with predictability. Predictability is rewarded with fewer disruptions. Fewer disruptions are rewarded with stability. Resistance, even passive resistance, carries invisible costs. Extra scrutiny. Extra delays. Extra pressure. Nothing dramatic. Nothing illegal. Just enough discomfort to teach a lesson. Eventually, People learn what behavior keeps the environment quiet. They become quieter too. Why silence becomes survival. Early on, speaking up feels necessary. Correcting mistakes feels important. Explaining yourself feels logical. Then patterns emerge. Speaking doesn't change outcomes. Complaints don't move timelines. Clarifications don't improve treatment. Worse, speaking marks you. Not officially, not on paper, but informally. As someone difficult, as someone complicated, as someone who needs watching. Silence, on the other hand, goes unnoticed. And in systems like this, being unnoticed is a form of safety. So silence spreads. The shrinking of personal space. Another subtle accelerator is the collapse of personal space. Not just physical space, but psychological territory. There is little room to decide how your time is used. Little control over how your body moves. Little influence over what happens next. At first, people try to reclaim control in small ways. Rearranging personal items. Creating routines. Developing private rituals. But even these are fragile. When personal territory can be altered without warning, the brain stops investing in it. Why decorate a space that isn't yours? Why attach meaning to objects that can disappear? Why form rituals that can be broken at any moment? The answer, eventually, is you don't. And when personal territory collapses, identity follows. The system's favorite outcome, emotional flatness. Highly emotional people are unpredictable. Angry people escalate situations. Hopeful people resist quietly. But emotionally flat people? They comply. They wait. They don't surprise anyone. Over time, the environment naturally favors emotional flattening. Not by force, but by attrition. Strong reactions fade when they go unanswered. Repeated disappointment teaches restraint. Repeated delays teach resignation. This isn't discipline. It's conditioning. And conditioning doesn't require intent, only repetition. The illusion of fairness. One of the most powerful stabilizers is the illusion of fairness. Rules exist. Procedures exist. Processes exist. On paper, everything looks structured. But lived experience is messy. Decisions feel distant. Timelines feel opaque. Outcomes feel arbitrary. People are told to follow steps. But the steps don't always lead anywhere. This creates a dangerous mental loop. If I just do everything right, things will improve. When improvement doesn't come, the fault feels personal, not systemic. This internalization is devastating. Instead of questioning the structure, people question themselves. What did I do wrong? Why didn't this work for me? What should I change next time? Eventually, self-questioning replaces self-expression. How waiting becomes a trap. Waiting is framed as temporary. Just wait. Just be patient. Just hold on. But waiting without information changes how the brain processes time. When outcomes are unclear, the mind cannot plan. When planning fails, motivation collapses. When motivation collapses, identity erodes. People stop thinking in terms of goals. They start thinking in terms of endurance. Survival replaces direction. And survival mode is incompatible with personal growth. The disappearance of accountability. Another quiet accelerant is the diffusion of responsibility. Decisions are made somewhere else. Authority is abstract. No single person feels fully responsible for outcomes. This creates a psychological vacuum. There's no one to argue with, no one to convince, no one to appeal to meaningfully. When accountability is invisible, resistance feels pointless. And pointless resistance fades faster than fear. Why recovery becomes so rare. By the time people realize what's happening, the damage is layered. Loss of agency, loss of narrative, loss of emotional range, loss of future orientation. Reversing this requires effort, support, and time. But effort feels unnatural after long-term passivity. Support is scarce. Time feels meaningless. So people don't rebuild. They adapt further. They become smaller versions of themselves, optimized for the environment. The most dangerous misinterpretation. From the outside, this looks like success. There are fewer disruptions, fewer conflicts, fewer visible problems. But what's actually happening is quiet collapse. Stability has been achieved by removing the parts of people that challenge the system. That isn't order. It's subtraction. Why this was always the outcome. No system designed for control can preserve full identity. That would require flexibility, resources, individual attention. Control systems don't scale with individuality. They scale with sameness. So disappearance isn't a failure. It's the most predictable outcome. the transition to acceptance. Eventually, something shifts. People stop thinking of themselves as temporarily diminished. They stop waiting for restoration. They accept a reduced version of themselves as permanent. This is not despair. It's worse. It's normalization. And once something becomes normal, it becomes invisible, even to the person living inside it. Why this chapter matters. Chapter 1 showed how identity begins to thin. This chapter shows why nothing stops it. Because stopping it would require the system to prioritize people over process. And that trade-off is rarely made. No entry pause point. Next comes the most disturbing phase. What happens when disappearance is mistaken for success? And how people begin to erase themselves willingly. By the time this phase begins, nothing feels violent anymore. There are no shocks, no confrontations, no obvious moments of loss. Instead, there is a quiet realization that resistance requires energy, and energy has become scarce. This is the stage where people don't just fade. They participate in their own disappearance. Not consciously, not willingly, but gradually, and with terrifying logic. The moment self-protection turns inward. At first, adaptation is about survival. People suppress reactions to avoid consequences. They simplify behavior to reduce friction. They limit emotional exposure to prevent disappointment. All of this makes sense, but the mind doesn't distinguish between temporary suppression and permanent change. What begins as a protective adjustment becomes a new default. And once something becomes default, questioning it feels unnecessary, even dangerous. The death of the inner voice. Every person has an internal narrator. It comments. It evaluates. It imagines alternatives. Over time, that voice changes. It speaks less, then only when necessary, then not at all, not because it was silenced, but because nothing listens anymore. When internal thoughts don't translate into action, the brain reduces their production. This is not depression in the dramatic sense. It's cognitive efficiency. Why waste resources on thoughts that lead nowhere? So the inner voice fades. And when the inner voice disappears, so does the sense of self. Why hope becomes dangerous? Hope sounds harmless, positive, necessary. But in environments where outcomes are disconnected from effort, hope becomes painful. It raises expectations that are rarely met. It creates emotional peaks followed by long crashes. It reminds people of a future they cannot reach. So the mind learns to suppress it, not through despair, but through caution. People stop allowing themselves to imagine better outcomes, not because they believe improvement is impossible, but because imagining it hurts too much. This is how people protect themselves from disappointment, by eliminating desire. The comfort of emotional numbness. Numbness has a reputation as a failure. In reality, it's a highly effective coping mechanism. Numb people don't suffer acutely. They don't oscillate between hope and loss. They don't feel the sting of waiting. They exist in a narrow emotional range where nothing hurts deeply, and nothing feels meaningful either. At this stage, numbness feels like peace. Calm, stable, manageable. And once numbness is experienced as relief, returning to full emotional range feels dangerous. Pain becomes unfamiliar. Joy feels overwhelming. Strong emotion feels like a liability. So people stay numb. Identity as a risk factor. Earlier, individuality was inconvenient. Now it feels risky. Having opinions invites disappointment. Having preferences invites frustration. Having goals invites loss. So people begin stripping identity voluntarily. They stop expressing tastes. They stop sharing memories. They stop referencing who they were. Not because they've forgotten, but because remembering feels unsafe. Identity becomes something to hide, not protect. The silent bargain. An unspoken bargain forms. I will make myself smaller if it makes things easier. And it works. Life becomes more predictable. Days feel smoother. There are fewer emotional spikes. But the cost is steep. Every time someone chooses not to care, not to react, not to imagine, something essential is traded away, piece by piece. When self-concept collapses, eventually, people struggle to answer basic questions internally. What do I want? What matters to me? Who am I when nothing is required of me? The answers don't come, not because they don't exist, but because the pathways to access them have withered. Self-concept relies on rehearsal. When it isn't practiced, it degrades. And without a functioning self-concept, people stop relating to themselves as agents. They relate to themselves as objects, something to be moved through time. The loss of moral urgency. Another shift happens quietly. Right and wrong blur, not in an ethical sense, but in a personal one. People stop feeling urgency about injustice directed at themselves. They recognize unfairness intellectually, but it doesn't spark action. This isn't apathy. It's learned irrelevance. When action doesn't change outcomes, moral energy shuts down. This is devastating because moral urgency is one of the last defenses of identity. Once it fades, self-erasure accelerates. Why this phase is so hard to reverse. From the outside, people appear calm, functional, adjusted. There are no obvious crises. Inside, however, rebuilding would require rediscovering desire, tolerating disappointment, re-engaging emotion, reclaiming narrative. Each of these feels exhausting, and exhaustion discourages effort. So people remain as they are, not broken, but incomplete. The illusion of choice. At this stage, people believe they are choosing this version of themselves. I'm just not that emotional. I don't need much. I'm fine the way I am. These statements feel empowering, but they are rationalizations. The range of available selves has narrowed so much that the remaining option feels like a choice, when it's really a constraint. When disappearance feels normal. Normalization is the most dangerous milestone. Once disappearance feels normal, it becomes invisible. People stop noticing what's missing. Stop grieving lost parts. Stop questioning the absence of ambition or joy. This isn't resignation. It's habituation. And habituation is extremely stable. The final internal shift. There is a final internal shift that marks this chapter's end. People stop thinking of their disappearance as something that happened to them. They start thinking of it as who they are. I've always been like this. This is just my personality. I don't need more. This is the point where erasure becomes self-sustaining. No pressure is required anymore. The system can step back. The work is done. Why this is the most tragic stage. Earlier phases can be explained by environment. This phase lives entirely inside the person, which means reversal feels like self-betrayal. To change would require admitting loss. To reclaim identity would require mourning what's gone. To rebuild would require hope. And hope feels dangerous now. So people stay where they are. Not because they can't leave, but because they no longer believe there is anything left to return to. The truth no one wants to face. This is how people disappear without dying. Not through force, not through punishment, not through violence, but through adaptation that goes too far. Through protection that becomes erasure. Through survival strategies that outlive the danger. No entry pause point. The next chapter exposes what happens when people who have disappeared are suddenly expected to function again, and why reintegration often fails catastrophically. Disappearance can remain invisible for a long time, as long as nothing is required. But eventually, a demand appears. A form must be filled. A decision must be made. A future must be discussed. A version of the self must step forward. And suddenly, the absence becomes obvious. Because the world doesn't interact with emptiness. It interacts with people. The shock of being needed again. For a long time, functioning meant compliance. Follow the routine. Meet expectations. Don't deviate. Then, without warning, the expectation changes. You're asked what you want. You're asked what you plan to do next. You're asked to explain yourself. And there is no answer. Not because the question is difficult, but because the internal machinery required to answer it has been dismantled. This moment produces panic, but not the loud kind. A cold, hollow panic. The realization that the version of you being requested no longer exists. Why reintegration feels like an attack. Reintegration assumes continuity. It assumes there is a stable self that endured quietly and is ready to resume. But disappearance breaks continuity. The internal story stopped being updated long ago. So when reintegration begins, it doesn't feel like opportunity. It feels like exposure. Like being asked to perform a role without a script. Decision paralysis. One of the earliest failures appears in decision-making. Even small choices feel overwhelming. What direction to take? What goals to pursue? What version of the future to commit to? This paralysis isn't laziness. It's structural damage. Decision-making requires belief that choices matter, confidence that effort changes outcomes, trust in one's own preferences. Those beliefs were systematically dismantled. Now, every decision feels risky. Wrong choices feel irreversible. Right choices feel imaginary. So people freeze. The return of emotion without regulation. Another shock follows. Emotion returns, but without buffering. Numbness protected against intensity. Now the protection is gone. Feelings arrive raw and unfiltered. Shame feels crushing. Anger feels explosive. Sadness feels endless. Without emotional regulation skills, people feel overwhelmed by states others manage daily. So they withdraw, not because they don't want connection, but because connection feels dangerous. Social identity collapse. Social roles depend on continuity. Friend, partner, colleague, parent. These roles assume shared memory, emotional availability, and responsiveness. Disappearance erodes all three. Conversations feel scripted. Relationships feel performative. Connection feels exhausting. People sense something is wrong. They may not say it outright, but distance grows. This reinforces the internal belief. I'm not built for this anymore. The shame loop. One of the most destructive consequences is shame. Not moral shame. Existential shame. I should be able to handle this. Others went through worse. What's wrong with me? This shame becomes internalized. Instead of seeking help, people hide. Instead of explaining, they isolate. And isolation accelerates collapse. Why support often fails? Support systems assume motivation. They offer advice. They suggest plans. They encourage optimism. But motivation requires identity. Without a stable sense of self, advice feels abstract. Plans feel fictional. Optimism feels insulting. Support misses the core issue. The problem isn't lack of effort. It's lack of selfhood. The performance trap. Some people try to perform normalcy. They memorize expected behaviors. They imitate emotional responses. They say the right things. This works, temporarily. But performance is exhausting. It creates a split between inner emptiness and outer compliance. Eventually, exhaustion wins. And collapse follows. Why many regress instead? When reintegration overwhelms, regression feels safer. Returning to structured environments. Returning to rigid routines. Returning to invisibility. Not because those spaces were healthy, but because they were familiar. Familiar pain feels safer than unknown possibility. The myth of getting back to normal. Normal assumes something stable to return to, but disappearance changed the person fundamentally. There is no old self waiting intact. There is only reconstruction. And reconstruction is slow, painful, and uncertain. No one prepares people for this. The system's final blind spot. The system that enabled disappearance measures success by absence of disruption. Quiet. Compliance. Stability. When people fail later, the failure appears personal, not structural. The system sees no error, which means nothing changes. The tragedy of delayed consequences. The most devastating part is timing. The harm appears long after the cause. When intervention feels late. When explanations feel inadequate. When responsibility feels diffuse. People are left holding damage they didn't knowingly choose. Why many never fully return? Some rebuild partially. They learn to function. They learn to manage symptoms. They learn to survive. But full restoration requires conditions rarely provided. Safety, agency, time, recognition. Without these, disappearance leaves a permanent imprint. The uncomfortable truth. Disappearance isn't corrected by freedom alone. Freedom without identity is disorienting. Choice without self is paralyzing. Opportunity without agency is meaningless. What this chapter reveals. Disappearance doesn't end when the environment changes. It follows the person. And unless addressed directly, it shapes everything that comes after. No entry pause point. The final chapter confronts the hardest question. Can identity be rebuilt? And if so, at what cost? By the time people realize they've disappeared, the damage is no longer abstract. It shows up in hesitation, in exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix, in the inability to recognize what they feel, even when they feel something strongly. This is the aftermath, not the moment of collapse. But what comes after, when the world assumes survival means recovery? The first lie, you're free now. Freedom is often treated like a cure, as if removing constraints automatically restores the self that existed before them. But disappearance doesn't work that way. The environment may change overnight. The internal structure does not. People discover quickly that freedom without identity is disorienting. There are too many options, too many expectations, too many unanswered questions. What should feel like relief instead feels like exposure. The absence that can't be explained. People struggle to articulate what's wrong. They don't feel sick. They don't feel broken in an obvious way. They just feel incomplete. There's a sense of distance between thought and action. They know what they should want. They know what they're supposed to feel, but the connection isn't there. This makes explanation nearly impossible, and what can't be explained is often dismissed. Why motivation doesn't return on its own? Motivation depends on belief. Belief that effort matters. Belief that outcomes are connected to action. Belief that the future belongs to you. Disappearance dismantles all three. So when people are told to try harder or focus on goals, the advice feels detached from reality. It assumes machinery that no longer exists. Without belief, motivation cannot sustain itself. The false hope of external structure. Some people attempt to replace internal identity with external structure. Strict schedules, rigid routines, overcommitment. At first, this works. Structure provides relief. Predictability calms anxiety. Busy schedules prevent introspection. But this is not recovery. It's substitution. And when the structure breaks, as it always does, the emptiness returns. The fragmented self. Disappearance doesn't erase everything. It fragments. Pieces remain. Skills without purpose. Memories without emotion. Values without urgency. People feel like a collection of parts without a center. They function, but they don't cohere. This fragmentation is exhausting, because every decision requires assembling a self from scratch. Why people mourn something they can't name. Grief usually follows loss. But here, the loss is ambiguous. There is no funeral, no moment of death, no clear before and after. People mourn quietly. They grieve a version of themselves they can't fully remember, but know is gone. This grief has nowhere to go, so it turns inward. The dangerous question, was I ever whole? At some point, a haunting doubt appears. What if this is who I really am? What if the person I remember was just a story? This doubt is corrosive. It undermines the possibility of recovery by reframing loss as illusion. If wholeness never existed, nothing needs to be rebuilt. This is how people abandon themselves completely. What recovery actually requires, and why it's rare. Recovery is not about returning to who you were. That version no longer exists. Recovery is about reconstruction. And reconstruction requires conditions that are difficult to sustain. Safety, emotional and psychological. Agency, real choices with real consequences. Time, without pressure to perform. Recognition, being seen as a person, not a problem. Without these, recovery stalls. Not because people fail, but because the process is undermined. The slow reappearance of the self. When recovery does happen, it doesn't look dramatic. There are no breakthroughs, no sudden clarity. Instead, there are small, almost invisible shifts. A preference reappears. An opinion forms spontaneously. A moment of anger feels justified instead of dangerous. These moments are fragile, but they matter because they signal something critical. The self is returning, not as memory, but as function. Why rebuilding hurts more than disappearing? Disappearance numbs pain. Rebuilding reintroduces it. Feeling again means confronting loss, regret, and wasted time. It means acknowledging what was taken and what was surrendered. This is why many people retreat. Numbness feels safer than grief. The cost of full awareness. Awareness comes with a price. Seeing clearly means seeing damage. It means recognizing that disappearance wasn't just something that happened, but something that reshaped you. There is no undoing that. Only integration. What healing really means here. Healing does not mean restoration. It means integration. Learning to live with missing parts. Learning to build meaning with altered capacity. Learning to accept that survival changed you. This is not defeat, but it is not triumph either. It is realism. The quiet success stories no one celebrates. Some people never fully recover and still build lives worth living. They create smaller worlds. They choose fewer attachments. They prioritize stability over intensity. This isn't failure. It's adaptation with awareness. But it requires honesty, not denial. The final truth. Disappearance without dying is not metaphorical. It is psychological, structural, cumulative. It doesn't announce itself, and it doesn't reverse easily. But understanding it changes something important. It replaces shame with context. It replaces self-blame with clarity. It replaces confusion with language. And language is the first step back toward selfhood. Why this story matters? Because this doesn't happen to weak people. It happens to people who adapted too well. People who survived by becoming smaller. People who were never meant to disappear, but did. Where this leaves us. Disappearance is not the end of the story, but it is a permanent chapter, and acknowledging it is the only way forward. Not toward who you were, but toward who you can still become. No entry pause point, final. This completes the core narrative. The final outro will tie the title directly to the viewer, leave a lasting psychological echo, deliver a quiet but powerful call to awareness. The ones who didn't die. Disappearance without dying doesn't leave scars you can point to. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't even feel like loss while it's happening. It feels like adjustment, like maturity, like survival. And that's why it's so dangerous. Because the people who disappear this way don't vanish from the world. They remain present, functional, and outwardly fine. They show up. They follow rules. They endure. But slowly, quietly, the part of them that asserts, chooses, and imagines slips away. What's left is someone who exists, but no longer fully lives. This doesn't only happen in extreme places or under extreme conditions. It happens anywhere identity is slowly traded for compliance, silence, and endurance. Anywhere survival is rewarded more than selfhood. Anywhere adaptation is mistaken for health. Anywhere being easy to manage matters more than being human. And the most unsettling truth is this. Most people who disappear without dying are never told it's happening. They're praised for coping, congratulated for stability, admired for resilience. No one warns them what resilience costs when it goes too far. So if any part of this story felt familiar, if the quiet numbness, the loss of direction, the shrinking of identity resonated, it doesn't mean you're broken. It means you adapted to something that required too much from you. Understanding that doesn't fix everything, but it does something important. It returns language where there was confusion, context where there was shame, and awareness where there was silence. And awareness is how disappearance stops being invisible. Because once you can name what's been taken, you can begin deciding what deserves to be reclaimed, and what must never be surrendered again. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.